Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. I'm Arjuna, and this is the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. Today I've got David B. Wolf on, and we're going to be discussing the problem of evil and research that he's done on the benefits of chanting Hare Krishna. So, David, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Arjuna.
And could you please start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
A little about myself. Well, one aspect of myself and my projects this lifetime, you mentioned back in the 1990s, as part of my Ph.D. dissertation, I conducted studies aligned with the most rigorous methods of modern social science on the effects of mantra chanting, and specifically Maha-Mantra chanting, on indicators of well-being like stress, depression, life satisfaction. And actually, before that, or a little earlier in my PhD program, I developed something called the Vedic Personality Inventory. It's a personality inventory, like personality inventories like the MMPI or MBTI, Myers-Briggs, Minnesota Multiphasic. So it's a personality inventory based on Vedic psychology, as described in places like Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam. And the research itself on developing the Vedic personality inventory really provided strong evidence in the context of what constitutes evidence in social science research for the efficacy, for the truth, we can say, of the paradigm of the three gunas. And then we used the Vedic Personality Inventory as one of the measuring instruments for the Maha-Mantra studies. Other things, if we go back into the 80s and early 90s, I spent many years in the Middle East, including a few years living with different Arabic Islamic populations and sharing bhakti-yoga philosophy and practice with those populations. I wrote a book about that back 30 years ago or so, entitled Krishna, Israel, and the Druze, An Interreligious Odyssey. And then in more recent decades, I've been involved in developing the Satvatove seminars. The name of our institute, Satvatove Institute. One of our branches is we have the Satvatove Institute School of Transformative Coaching. It's a fully accredited school by the International Coach Federation for training spiritually based coaches. So the term Satvatove, Sattva, from the ancient Sanskrit, indicating goodness or enlightenment, and Tov, from the biblical Hebrew, means something similar to Sattva, goodness. So we do writing, we develop and conduct seminars and different trainings to support people to distinguish reality from illusion, and in auspicious transformation of consciousness and life. As you're aware, I've served in areas like in 1998, I established an international child protection office and served as director for 3 years. I have two adult children, ages 27 and 30. Actually 28 and 30. So there's different places I can go, but I'm glad that you invited me and to discuss, we're speaking about whatever inspires you and your audience here.
Sounds like there's lots of topics we could discuss with you. I'll have to read some of your books. We can have you on again on some other topics as well. So one interesting topic is the research you've done on chanting Hare Krishna. I think it's probably somewhat unprecedented too, that devotees don't tend to get so much into empirical investigations of how to prove these things to skeptics, but this is something you've done. So could you explain a bit about the research you did on the benefits of chanting Hare Krishna? Or maybe first say something about the hypothesis of chanting Hare Krishna being beneficial.
Okay. Yeah, so the various hypotheses for the studies We just borrowed directly from the ancient Vedic literatures that the I think you're speaking, but I'm not hearing you right now.
No, I'm not talking right now.
You're not?
No.
Okay. All right. So I'll keep going. Yeah. So we borrowed the hypothesis from ancient Vedic literatures, and so the Vedic literatures assert, and we tested these assertions in alignment with rigorous modern social science research methods, and so that and it just, I mean, basic everyone's experience that different sound vibrations affect us in different ways. Let's say if someone is sitting in a room for half an hour with Mozart playing, or someone's sitting in a room for half an hour with hard punk rock playing. So probably for most, for a substantial percentage, majority, there's going to be a difference in the consciousness after that half hour. So according to the Vedas, there are three modes of nature, and different sound vibrations are in different modes of nature and will affect us in different ways. Some sound vibrations will affect us more towards peace or anger or laziness, like that. So the Hare Krishna Maha-Mantra, which the Vedas recommend as really a most recommended process for self-realization and consciousness raising in this age. Idi Shoda Shakam Nam Nam Kali Kalmasha Nashanam Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. That's from the ancient Upanishad. So it's described that this mantra is completely in sattva, even so completely in sattva, it's like it's in a different mode altogether called Shuddha Sattva, which is like a technical point. So anyhow, the Vedas assert that by chanting this mantra, people will reduce their toxic stress, reduce their depression, increase their life satisfaction. So we tested that according to modern social science methods, and for the most part, the results confirmed the Vedic assertions.
Cool. So do you want to explain the research you did and what the findings were?
Well, okay. It depends. For sure, we can go into as much detail as we want to go into. I certainly don't have on the top of my head all the numbers, but this is my dissertation published in book form. I could look into details. Essentially, though, okay. So we started with a single system design, which means we started with an experiment with 8 people with a baseline using self-rating inventories on scales that were rigorously validated by top social science researchers on stress, on depression, on life satisfaction, on verbal aggressiveness, and we included a few other variables. And the single system design research results were strong and impressive enough to warrant a more rigorous group design. The group design had three groups. So we had one group, I can look at the details, but approximately 30 to 35 participants in each group. And one of the screening criteria was that the participants have not chanted mantra previous to the study. And there's a lot of other screening criteria to control, to strengthen the validity and reliability of the research design. So one group chanted Hare Krishna Maha-Mantra about 25 minutes per day for about 4 weeks, and we measured them at baseline on the different on the different dependent variables and like that. And then another group didn't do anything. They were a control group. They simply did the packet of self-rating inventories at baseline after 4 weeks and then another month after that. And a third group chanted I'll call it a placebo mantra. A placebo mantra, which was, it was a collection of Sanskrit words or syllables that I just sort of concocted, but they thought it was a real mantra. So I guess there could be some ethical discussion there around ethics for science and things like that. Anyhow, we did it. And so the results essentially, and there's a lot of statistical tables around this, but essentially, but with strong statistical validation, that the Maha-Mantra chanting group with strong statistical significance at the 95% confidence interval decrease their stress, decrease their depression, increase their life satisfaction more than the control group and more than the placebo mantra chanting group. We also controlled for various things. We also looked at relationship with gender and age and number of siblings and a few things related to construct validity, predictive validity, concurrent validity, different types of statistical validation measures. Hare Krishna.
So what exactly were you measuring?
What exact measure? Okay, we were measuring stress level. Stress level at the beginning at the baseline, at the beginning of the month. And then stress levels after 4 weeks of chanting Hare Krishna, about 25 minutes a day on japa beads, or after chanting a placebo mantra. And then also 4 weeks later, also for, like as a follow-up, 4 weeks, stress levels, depression levels, life satisfaction levels.
But we're not to understand that chanting Hare Krishna is a stress relief method. I guess the stress relief would be an indicator of a preliminary benefit that comes from chanting Hare Krishna, and we can assume that other aspects are true, but just not as measurable.
Yeah, right. Okay, so then that discussion goes to, right, if we reference the Vedic paradigm, then this, decrease of toxic stress and more happiness. These are just byproducts. These are just byproducts, and of what the Vedas assert are the actual, let's say, more intrinsic and essential purpose of chanting the Hare Krishna Maha-Mantra, supporting, energizing the self to turn towards itself and self-realization, the self to turn towards the divine, the supreme person in an attitude of devotion. And by that phenomena, by that experience, the self turning towards itself and self-discovery, turning towards the absolute in a spirit of devotion, then decreasing material stress and enhanced fulfillment and joy. These are natural byproducts, for sure.
Right. So what would you say to somebody that says, oh, of course chanting is going to give some stress relief? That's to be expected. And even if this mantra gives more stress relief than the placebo mantra, why assume all the other metaphysics is true? Why not just think, oh, it gives stress relief and that's the only thing that's true?
Well, I would agree with them. I would agree that, so basically what we did in our studies, and I'll mention that in more recent years, I've been involved on teams led by Dr. Demerla, who are studying the effects of chanting Hare Krishna on improving heart health and the some of the findings are already published, and the results are encouraging. Meaning, again, confirming the Vedic hypotheses that on mental, emotional, and also on physical levels, this chanting is healthy. So, okay, so as far as your devil's advocate argument, well, I would, yeah. So we're using anumana, to use a Vedic term, in the inferential empirical science methods. And the results confirm the Vedic hypothesis to a significant degree. And the methods we're using are imperfect. So I'm certainly not claiming that by using these empirical methods, this in itself, let's call it in a vacuum, this in itself affirms the truth of Vedic assertions. At the same time, that this method, these methods are, it's really using these methods. It's to a large extent, it's for those who have faith and trust in these anumana, inferential, positivistic type methods. And so I've experienced many, if I look back over the 25 years since I've embarked on this endeavor, many because they see, because they see the results and they have faith in these methods. And we understand these methods, of course, they have shortcomings, including my study. And any good write-up will discuss the limitations and shortcomings. And I believe I do that in my articles and dissertation. But I've seen many who they're, let's call it, completely non-theistic. They have no trust in the Vedas or anything like that. But they see how rigorously these studies are done, and they go, "Oh, okay, well, all right," and they have trust in these methods, so they start chanting, and then they experience the results, and then they get inspiration to incorporate into their life other methods of bhakti yoga. I've seen many. I'll even say I've seen many hardcore, cynical atheists be impressed by the rigorousness of these social science studies on the Hare Krishna Maha-Mantra and the Vedic Personality Inventory, and it's moved them to try the chanting, even if it's for secular purposes. And then just a few weeks later, a few months later, a few years later, they're enthused to incorporate bhakti yoga fully into their life. And okay, so I there's more I could say there, but I'll pause there in case you want to.
So perhaps the logic is something like, if you have a giant block of cheese and you take a piece off of it and you eat it and it's cheese and it tastes good, how many pieces do you need to take off the block of cheese and taste before you can infer that the entire block of cheese is made out of cheese and is tasty? You know, maybe one piece is enough.
Maybe one, or maybe like, well, I still have doubts. Let me try 3 or 4. Well, I have less. I like that analogy, Arjun. I expect that I'll borrow it.
Well, it's kind of like the rice analogy, right? When you're cooking rice, you only need to test one grain to see if it's cooked. But the difficulty here, I mean, scientists do the same thing. They'll have a theory, and there'll be a lot of it will be untestable, but there'll be aspects that it's like, well, if our theory is true, we will find this. Like this general theory of relativity, right? They expected to find light bending as it traveled around the sun, which they measured during a solar eclipse. That wasn't proof of every aspect of the theory. It's just a piece of data which is consistent with the model. If we find this, then we've got reason to believe the hypothesis. It's not that we've proven every detail of the ontology.
Right.
So we just take the bits that are testable. If all the bits that are testable pan out, then it's sensible to assume that the rest of it also will pan out.
Yeah.
People are saying they're having trouble hearing me. I wonder if it looks like my sound is coming through a little bit quieter than yours, but I don't know why. I don't know what setting I've got that would change that. But anyway, if you're still having trouble hearing me, let me know. The other direction we can go, which is probably more carrying on from where you were going before, is like, for example, you get there's 2 stories which you might know the detail on better than me. I should do a video on them and actually like get all the details right one day. But there's the police officer in America who was asked to go undercover and check out the Hare Krishnas. This was probably in the 70s or 80s when there were all sorts of cults and stuff going on, and that were up to real bad things, and so they wanted to check out the Hare Krishnas. And after about a year, he came forward and told the devotees what he was up to, and that he had actually had his heart changed and was now doing it for real. And there was another story of in India, I believe, someone who saw on a magazine Prabhupada had a nice watch in a photo. He thought, I want to steal that watch. He was a thief. And so, he found out who it was and, moved to the temple, found out Prabhupada was going to be there in a couple of months. So he moved into the temple, waited for Prabhupada to come, and was doing service in the temple. By the time Prabhupada arrived, his heart had been purified. And when he went to see Prabhupada, he said, I actually joined originally because I wanted your watch, but now I've changed. Prabhupada took off his watch and gave it to him, which is also an interesting story. But yeah, the point here, so I've raised these points. I had Nathan Ormond, who runs the channel Digital Gnosis, on, and I gave these examples to him. And he was kind of pushing back on this idea that, well, why should the fact that, people practice it and they become convinced, or people practice it and they become happy, healthy, like if social science, if it's true that social science proves that chanting Hare Krishna makes you healthier, happier, and live longer, would that also be an indication that that theism, well, let's just say theism in general, that theism is true?
Okay. Thanks for your sharing. Yeah. Thanks for your questions, Arjun. I'm reminded of another metaphor we sometimes use, like if we have a road map, like if I want to travel from Florida to California, okay, so I can say, well, I'm skeptical about this map, but let's say I follow the map, and after 100 miles, all the landmarks are right on, and okay, at some point you'll be passing by Oklahoma, and at some point you'll come towards the Rocky Mountains, and then so it's like, well, there's been 100 landmarks, and they've all been right where the map says they should be. So I can remain skeptical, yeah, but this last 500 miles might be complete nonsense. Or I can say, well, I have more trust now in this map than I had when I left Florida. So, this discussion, it gets into epistemology, right? A major area of philosophy, truth. How do we know what's true? And so, right. So the empirical methods, including the empirical research methods I used for the Maha-Mantra studies, we certainly don't say that they prove in themselves any truth about the Vedas. I'll say they provide some impressive evidence for some vital Vedic assertions about the nature of the modes of nature, about the nature of genuine mantra chanting. So they provide some evidence, so different people, scholars or whatever, will have different, let's call it different epistemological commitments. And so the Vedic epistemology, of course, there's sometimes it's divided into 10 types of epistemology, sometimes condensed into 3, right? Like pratyaksha, direct sense perception, anumana, inference based on sense observations, and then the Shabda Brahman. So, okay, so according to the Vedas, that the spirit soul intrinsically possesses knowledge. And then, okay, so then this Maha-Mantra, this Hare Krishna Maha-Mantra, according to the Vedas, and someone can, they can have their stance about skepticism, belief, whatever. But according to the Vedas, the Maha-Mantra, a genuine mantra, reveals truth. And more than that, the mantra itself is identical to the truth that it reveals. So that provides an explanation about why people reduce their stress and reduce their depression and enhance their life satisfaction. Because it provides an explanation, I'll say, as good or better than any other explanation for the mechanism of why chanting Hare Krishna Maha-Mantra works. That chanting the mantra itself, apart from our cognitive understanding or lack of it, of the philosophy behind mantra, chanting this Hare Krishna Maha-Mantra, that the mantra, that it's identical with the truth it reveals, and thus the chanter, let's call it the irreducible quanta of consciousness, that is the actual person inside the gross and subtle material bodies, that atomic unit of sentience that is the actual chanter, experiences the truth of itself as spirit, the truth of itself as not matter, not material body, the truth of itself in connection with the supreme and the absolute. And that's the actual pratyaksha, as opposed to the faulty material direct sense perception, which is, like I see the sun as a yellow circle in the sky 3 inches in diameter. But even with more sophisticated material knowledge through the anumana inferential process, I understand it's not a circle in the sky like 3 inches in diameter like my mind sees, but it's actually 1.4 million times the volume of Earth and things like that. So the Vedas give the self a direct experience of itself as an eternal, blissful, fully cognizant spiritual being. And like an example that Bhaktivedanta Swami uses is like, okay, like if I've eaten a full meal, and like someone can say, well, can you prove that you're full? And we can try to take measurements of the stomach or whatever, but we just like, I have full experience that I'm completely full, like that. So spiritually, by chanting this Hare Krishna Maha-Mantra, because the mantra not only reveals the truth about the distinction between matter and spirit and ultimate spirit and so many truths, but it's the mantra is it's non-different from the truth itself, and so that's experienced, and that experience is in a sense it's not dependent on cognitive or philosophical understanding, and that experience for the experiencer is at least often unarguable and just not deniable.
The being full from eating analogy is pretty good, and it's right there in the Bhagavatam too, which is nice. I've used that before, and it's like if you were eating and satisfied, what is it there? It says, just as one engaged in the process of eating experiences 3 things simultaneously: their hunger goes away, they get nourishment, and they experience pleasure. So the question would be, could somebody be deluded and think that their hunger is going away? Of course, that's a qualia. So, you can't think your hunger is gone when it's not actually gone, just like you can't think you have a headache when you don't have a headache, because having a headache is defined by the experience. So obviously that one, a scientist can't tell you you don't have a headache when you do. I mean, sometimes people go to the doctor in pain and the doctor says, there's no reason for you to be in pain. You're not in pain. And that's just gaslighting. The person's obviously in pain. They know better than the doctor. So obviously that one, the doctor can't be right and you be wrong. But could you think you're getting nourishment and the doctor tell you, oh, actually, you just think you're getting nourishment, but you're not? Or could you think, I guess the pleasure one is also a qualia. So the only one that you could be wrong about is the nourishment. And like, let's say you're hiking up mountains and I watched a documentary a few weeks ago about some people climbing up, like rock climbing this wall. So the people climbed all the way to the top of the wall. Could it be the case that they weren't getting any nourishment from their food? Could the doctor say, oh, even though you climbed all the way up this wall, you weren't getting any nourishment from your food? So perhaps that's also something that you can't be wrong about. Or perhaps you could be completely imagining that you climbed up the wall. At that point, the skepticism gets absurd, though, right?
Yeah, well, I like the way you say that. At that point, the skepticism gets absurd. Like, like, sure, I mean, there can always be like, yeah, well, what it could be this, or can you prove it? And then, okay, then we get, well, yes, we can prove it. Just like, to what extent are you willing to go into the laboratory? Right? Proof beyond proof to supplement logic means you go into the laboratory to mix the 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. So, yeah, so when the skepticism goes to those places, I guess I'm interested to ask the skeptic, and I like to discuss with skeptics, including in this conversation. You're role playing a skeptic. It sharpens my intelligence. I appreciate it, and at some point in the conversation, it's my role to ask, well, what are your epistemological commitments? Because if all someone's able to do is go, yeah, but what about this? Yeah, but what about this? Yeah, but I know that you can't know anything. Okay, well, where did you get that knowledge? Or like that? What are your epistemological commitments? I'm glad to share with you mine, and why why they make sense to me, and why they're vital principles to me that satisfy my intelligence and my heart and the spirit soul that I am. I'm glad to share with you mine, and so, and I've shared some of them here. That the self is intrinsically filled with knowledge. That knowledge comes through a process. There's a scientific process of self-realization. Prabhupada used the term science of self-realization, bhakti-yoga. Knowledge on the spiritual platform is self-revealing. These are some epistemological commitments that, based on my study over many decades, these are satisfying for me on all levels, including intellectual. And I'm glad to share more about that. And then, yeah, what are your epistemological convictions? Let me hear them.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I say to skeptics when their skepticism is too far on one side is, you're expecting me to prove to you that God exists using an epistemology with which I cannot even prove to you my own existence.
Okay. Yeah.
Obviously, that's not going to go anywhere. We need to be able to know there's a sun in the sky, the existence of other minds, external world realism. If our epistemology can't get us those things, then of course we're not going to get anything about the metaphysical reality beyond this material world. And I think, and arguably, if we can know that, the difference between waking life and dreaming life, the fact that other people are conscious, the fact that there's a real world outside of mind, then with that same epistemology, we could know something of a metaphysical reality, something of theism.
Yeah. And I appreciate those points, Arjuna. And for me, it relates. I mean, yeah, it relates to personalism at the very foundation, at the substrata of existence, because we can get into how do you know. And so I work a lot with psychological process, my own and others. I conduct a lot of coaching and therapy, and it's a big part of what I do. And so I like how you said, like a priori assumptions, like, so to know something, we need a proper means to know it. So like these anumana, empirical, inferential, positivistic type methods, they're not completely, but they're pretty effective to get to know objects that are relatively lacking in consciousness, like a rock, like inanimate, because we can control those objects, take it into our laboratory, subject them to heat, or pour chemicals and see how they react. And to the extent that the consciousness of the object is increased, then those methods become less and less effective. Even the term objective science, well, there's problems with that term. But even if we accept the term objective science, yeah, in a sense, it's pretty effective to study objects, not particularly effective in studying subjects. And so, like, if the subject becomes a human being, that's why fields such as psychology, sociology, politics, economics, they're called inexact sciences as opposed to mathematics, physics, like that, because there's this disturbing thing called consciousness happening, and that's why in social science we're not able to predict, in a deterministic way. Yes, okay, at that street corner at 2:02 p.m. there's going to be an attempted murder, because there's consciousness involved. So to study a being of relatively evolved consciousness, like human beings, those methods are very limited. The methods of, let me take you into my laboratory and analyze you. Maybe through such methods, I can learn something about Arjuna by observing you and analyzing. But if I really want to get to know you, Arjuna, then for sure a much better method is I gain your love and trust. I serve you. I gain your love and trust. Then naturally you're inspired to reveal yourself to me, with more and more intimacy, more and more vulnerability, with confidentiality, as trust increases through service. So applying that method to the Supreme, first of all, it assumes that the Supreme is a personal conscious entity. The substratum of all existence is a personal conscious entity. A technical name for that in Vedic terminology is Vasudeva. So applying that method to the Supreme, that's called bhakti. It's called bhakti-yoga. The connection with the Supreme through devotional service, and then the Supreme as a person reveals himself to us to the extent of to the extent that we've gained that, to the extent that we've given ourselves with humility and service.
One simple way we could touch on that point is the gold standard in objective science is the controlled experiment.
Yeah.
And it's like there's scientists out there that think only things exist which I can control. If it can't be proven to exist using a controlled experiment, then it doesn't exist, which is clearly silly, right? So obviously, if we're studying something which is beyond our ability to control, we're not going to be able to use the same methods, and we're not going to be able to have the same kind of certainty, or at least it'll come with a completely different epistemology. So coming back to like how we get to the existence of other minds, I mean, one way you could describe it is just intuition, right? The quality of my experience of other people, it's self-evident to me based on the quality of that experience that they are conscious. I could not have this quality of experience of other people with them just being philosophical zombies or meat robots. There must be somebody home.
Yes, right. We can call it intuition. We can call it some connection with a higher guidance within. A Vedic term is Paramatma, like that irreducible quanta of consciousness that is us. That's called Atma. And then Paramatma, that there's an expansion of the absolute sitting right next to us in the region of the heart. And to the extent that we're free from static in our mind and consciousness, then we get that kind of higher intelligence intuition from Paramatma. And you use the word silly. I'll suggest it's even beyond silly. It's like a mental aberration, what you indicated earlier, that because I mean, that I think a technical term for that view, that if something can't be proved by controlled experiment, it doesn't exist. I think that's scientism, which becomes like the blind faith religion, dogmatic religion of science, at the expense of the possibility of any other possible foundations for knowledge, and there's no scientific evidence for that. So it becomes a dogmatic scientism. And so, because the essential assertion there is that nothing can possibly exist that's superior to me in consciousness. Because if the only epistemology I'm willing to use to study anything, including the possibility of an ultimate consciousness, God, whatever term someone wants to use, higher intelligence, if the only epistemology I'm willing to use is an epistemology that only works with objects that are inferior to me in consciousness, then the a priori statement and stance I'm saying, by using that epistemology and saying that it's the only possible epistemology, logical empiricism, that sort of thing, the statement I'm making implicitly is categorically nothing can possibly exist that's superior to me in consciousness. So my statement essentially is, I am God. I am God. So if that was stated more explicitly, then they might be in like different institutions for the institution of mental health. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. Jordan Peterson made an interesting argument in his debate with Sam Harris that he gave a kind of proof for something existing, something divine existing, which was when you pray. Oh no, it was something about prayer. So if you pray, something that some situation you're stuck in, and you pray for an answer will come. It might not be the answer you were looking for. It might not come when you expect it, but some answer will come. And Jordan Peterson's point is, where does that answer come from? In other words, why not think that it's coming from God? How could we be getting this kind of knowledge coming into our heart spontaneously? I mean, a lot of great genius inventions, the people that invented them say it just appeared in my mind spontaneously all at once. So where is this stuff coming from? So the point I was going there is, as an epistemology for interacting with God, is, if it's just your mind, you might be able to delude yourself. But, if we send messages out into space and they come back and they're intelligible replies and they contain information that we don't have, like suppose the aliens sent back an explanation of how to do, cold fusion. And nobody on Earth has been able to figure out how to do cold fusion for hundreds of years of trying, or decades of trying. I don't know the details. If we get an answer back that tells us how to do that, then we're kind of sound in our assumption that that was coming from aliens or some other kind of intelligence out there in the cosmos. So similarly, if we're getting answers, our prayers being answered, and realizations coming into our heart as a result of our prayers, why just think that's our subconscious brain?
Well, we might be inclined to think that because we have some bias or predetermined prejudice that they're like, I refuse to open to the possibility that there are beings of vastly more evolved consciousness than me. So this reminds, when I was doing my Ph.D. dissertation literature review back in the mid to late 90s, I remember one study I came upon, and we studied thousands of articles, maybe a few hundred of them got listed in my dissertation. This study was done in the late 80s, Bird, and it was published in a journal. And this was research on the effects of prayer on heart health, on patients who were recovering from heart surgery, from maybe a heart attack. Okay. And so, of course, so there were, there was random assignment. It was a very rigorous study. All studies have their shortcomings, but it was a rigorous study, and it was double blind, right? The gold standard. It was double blind, meaning that so there was a group who was praying for some of the patients. They were praying to, I'll call it the Judeo-Christian God. And So one group of patients was being prayed for, and the other group of patients was not being prayed for. The group of patients who was being prayed for didn't know they were being prayed for, and the group that didn't know they were being prayed for didn't know which group they were in. And the medical staff, the doctors, the nurses, they didn't know who was being prayed for. And the results were very statistically strong indication. It was very clear. Though the group that was being prayed for, they recovered quickly. And there was controls. It was a very rigorous experiment. They recovered more quickly than the group who was not being prayed for. Now, something extremely interesting from my point of view is maybe you and your listeners have perhaps never heard about that study, and most of the world hasn't. It's in a very respected journal. That's it. So now what I thought, and I wrote about this in my dissertation, that if the same sorts of results in terms of improving heart health were found due to an experiment on testing a new pharmaceutical drug, I'm sure there would be TV commercials about it. There would be like invest more millions of dollars in more experiments. Let's publish this. Let's get FDA approval. But because the results, which were very strong in terms of improving health, the results were about prayer to God. It just gets buried by the establishment.
Right. That's funny. There's one famous psychiatrist or psychologist, I can't remember his name, but he's got this quote that theism is psychology's best kept secret.
Okay.
Maybe you're aware of the quote. So he's basically making the point that the psychological benefits of believing in God are psychology's best kept secret.
I like that. I haven't heard that, but
I'll dig out the quote and send it to you. Yeah, it's really good.
It's great. Yeah.
So yeah, went back on the epistemology thing. So I think that the ability to prove objective morality, external world realism, the existence of other minds, and so on, you kind of need it's the same sort of epistemology that will work for proving theism in a sense. It's kind of intuition, self-evidence. So one word we could use for that, Adi Purusha, another devotee who's doing a bit of philosophy of religion work, is working on this epistemology that uses the phrase a cognition, which is like a sense data, realness, which is the quality of the sensory experience, and a concept which the sense data lines up with. So, a common example in epistemology is if you're having a hot shower, you could the realness of the sensation of the hot water proves to you that the water is actually hot. It's not just that you're imagining it, because it's got this quality of realness. And of course, we had someone else on for a discussion who does philosophy of science, and he's like, "Well, what do you mean by realness?" And I don't think you can really define it. I think it's just something you can only show by example, like the difference between a dream and waking life. And similarly, there might be a difference between waking life and a more elevated level of consciousness. It might be the same step in difference. And this brings in a valuable point of ascending levels of realization. So you're probably familiar with the mango analogy that you could be eating green mangoes your entire life and think that you're eating ripe mangoes, but the first time you eat a ripe mango, you'll know the difference, and you'll know that you're eating green mangoes your whole life. So a way we can prove this kind of thing is that there's no going backwards. So, children grow up and they believe all sorts of silly things, but once they become adults, they can no longer adopt those same silly beliefs. I don't know what a good example is. You might have some, but once you actually come to truth, and you come to the truth through actually knowing it, not just by like someone telling you what to believe and you just believe what you're told to believe, but you actually directly perceive the truth, there's no going backwards. And so these ascending levels of realization are really crucial. So, just like we can know external world realism, the existence of other minds, and so on, we can come to even higher levels of realization where we find out the truths of particular theology or universal religious principles. We met like Bhagavad Gita says, the self-realized souls can impart knowledge unto you because they have seen the truth. This word
in the truth.
seeing is used a lot. Do you want to comment on that?
Okay. All right. That's some fascinating interplay of threads there. Okay, sure. Thank you. All right. So, okay. Well, two threads come to mind that are related. So one is, like when I say, we can see, we can be illusion. So we can't, if we want to be productive in the discussion, we can't avoid, well, what is this self that's seeing? What is this self that's experiencing? And right. There's a lecture from Prabhupada where he makes it clear it's not like these eyeballs and the retina that sees, right? The eye, the nose, the tongue. These are actually seats of the actual senses of the soul. This is dead matter. It's not that the ears hear, but the soul has a sense of hearing. So it's remember, this was, well, that was in it's about 6 years ago. I was in Colorado conducting a presentation to it was a hospital faculty. Most of the audience was doctors, nurses, medical professionals. I started the presentation. I said, let's say someone comes to you and says, I've hurt my finger. So I said, in that simple phrase, my finger, there are two entities. There's the finger and there's the owner of the finger. Of course, I've stolen all of this from Srila Prabhupada, like that, but I give it my particular language. There's the finger and the owner of the finger. So I asked them, who are you treating? I asked the doctors, who are you treating, the finger or the owner of the finger? The director of the hospital, he was there, and he looked rather stunned. And he said, well, David, that's a simple question. But we've never really thought about it. And everyone else, we've never really thought about that. So I said, well, it's a very important question, because the finger essentially is made of the same stuff as that window shade or the chair. It's dead matter. There's no healing potency in the finger. The healing potency is in the irreducible quantum consciousness that animates the body. So we need to look like, of course we can be illusioned. Of course our experience is imperfect. There's a material pratyaksha is it's even more imperfect than material anumana. So to the extent that I'm misidentifying the self with either the gross body or the subtle body, basic analogy, hardware, software, we're not the hardware. We're not the software. I'm the operator of the computer. So to the extent that I'm misidentifying the self, then of course I can be like, I might completely, I think I'm happy, just like if I think I'm the car, not realizing I'm the driver of the car, then when I fill it up with gas, I could think, oh, my thirst is slaked. When it goes through the car wash, I could think, oh, I'm clean. But someone with objective vision can see, no, you haven't had water for 2 days. You haven't had a bath or a shower for 2 weeks. No, you're in miserable condition. Or another analogy, if we're in this virtual reality game, and then whatever, my character in the game wins big and whatever they do, or they have a terrible catastrophe, oh, I'm crushed. Oh, I'm ecstatic because my character defeated the enemy. But someone with objective vision can say, you're just kind of in this dream world. You're just sitting there wasting away, and you look terrible, like that. So sure, if we're misidentifying, this is ontology. Like if we're misidentifying who we are and supporting others to misidentify who they are, bayam dvitiya binivesha tasyat, the root cause of all anxiety is misidentification of the eternal spiritual self with matter, misidentification of the driver with the car. So then, material pratyaksha, material anuman, of course it's subject to, I might think I'm happy, but I'm really in terrible condition. We can give so many examples of just, the child sees the sun as a circle in the sky. That's the direct experience. The child's an illusion. It's not a 3-inch diameter circle in the sky. The child's an illusion. So that's why when I first developed the Vedic Personality Inventory, starting in 1996, my essential approach, or you'd say the essence of my research inspiration, was to establish, based on the Vedic hypotheses and assertions, an empirical basis for happiness, not just happiness, an empirical basis for peace, security, fulfillment, empowerment, all those experiences of life and self that like everyone's striving for, usually in a misdirected way. So the Vedas assert that to the extent that one develops sattvic as opposed to rajasic or tamasic worldviews and habits in all areas of life, that corresponds with enlightenment, lower stress, lower depression, fulfillment, enrichment, empowerment, vitality, peace. It corresponds with all those experiences everyone's looking for, because it corresponds with the self, with the driver of the car realizing, I'm not the car, I'm the driver of the car, with the owner of the finger realizing, I'm not dead matter. I'm this being that's intrinsically imbued with knowledge. So from that consciousness, that sattvic consciousness, we naturally see things more clearly, and we process our experience in a way that's closer to, I'll call it, absolute reality, as opposed to something relative or just completely illusory. When I say absolute, because that word can trigger people, absolute, simply truth that is valid in all time and space. So like if I say, hello, Arjuna, I'm David Wolf. I'm 60 years old. I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That is not absolute truth. It's relative. Was I David Wolf, 60 years old, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 100 years ago? What about 1 trillion years from now? So, so I'm not the car, I'm not the body. I'm that atomic unit of sentience that inhabits the body. And my intrinsic nature is to serve the absolute with devotion. So these are truths that are true in all time and space. And these are the sorts of truths that something like chanting genuine mantra, like the Maha-Mantra, reveal and are identical to.
Right. I can't remember what the other point I was going to make is. Somebody's pushing back on the research you quoted, saying the study you quoted was from 1997, and there was another one study that was. Bring it here. There was another study from 2006, which showed, which gave opposite results. The group that was prayed for came out worse. So I don't know how up to date you are on the literature or not.
Yeah. Okay. The study I quoted was, if I remember correctly, is from 1988. Because I did my literature review in like 96, 97. Yeah. Well, okay. So I still stand by my point. I stand by my point that in 1988, if that study with that level of rigorousness was published, and if the independent variable was some pharmaceutical, it would have become a lot more well known than this study that on prayer. I stand by that point. That's my point of view. Now, and okay, so that's the point of empirical research. That in practically any field you can read, yes, well, based on the research, we used to think that, but now we know that. So so for sure, the study that Bird conducted in 1988, of course it has shortcomings. And the more recent research on prayer, which I'm not up to date on, a little bit, not rigorously. The more recent research that shows different, okay, that has strength and shortcomings too. That has strength and my Maha-Mantra studies has strength and shortcomings. It's imperfect. And that's the nature of the empirical research process.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it would be interesting to have a debate with that actually went into detail in all of the scientific literature. I haven't taken it up myself because studying the scientific literature to the degree where you could debate it is kind of daunting. I don't have time for that. Like, there's so many details you can go into, like what kind of prayer were they using? Was it legitimate prayer, or were they doing it in such a way that, the Christians, they object to it and say, oh, they were doing, like just kind of saying, hey, God, fix this person. There's who's doing the praying, what's the mood by which they're doing it, and so on. There's so many variables when you're measuring consciousness. Satvatove Prabhupada has an example in science where to compare this kind of thing, like I don't know if you know much about physics, but when you're measuring gravity, it's such a subtle thing you're saying to measure the force of gravity. They have to do it at night. If cars driving past on the road, the vibration for that can cause it to not work. So if a physics student attempts to measure gravity and fails, they'll simply be told they were doing it wrong.
Right.
So I don't see any, so many millions of people all through history have gotten the fruits of theism to their own satisfaction. Then when someone comes along and says, oh, I tried it and it didn't work, it's like, well, you must have not been doing it right, because it worked for so many other people. But when you say that kind of thing, they'll say, oh, hey, you're accusing me of being insincere, you're questioning my motivations, I was sincere, how dare you psychologize me. That brings up lots of other points. You can comment.
I appreciate those comments and those points, including the gravity research. Yeah, and so again, in quoting the bird research from 1988, it was to indicate that in at least back then, and I think probably it is changing as decades go on, but there was some bias in academia, certainly in psychology and probably in medicine too, some bias, let's call it, again, some non-scientific dogmatic bias against anything that might support something that is something existing other than matter. I'll put it that way. Okay, and then I'm not saying that. So I'm standing by that point, and the bird research and what happened to it indicates that. At the same time, I'm not saying the bird research was as a higher level of empirical research than the other research the listener cited. So so it's not for me to say how sincere or not sincere someone is. I say I've for about 40 years. Actually, I started consuming prasadam, which is another part of the process of bhakti-yoga, in 1980. And I started, with some seriousness, chanting Hare Krishna Maha-Mantra in 1983. And I actually decided that way. At the time I was in Israel, in the Middle East, and I decided to do an experiment, because the philosophy I was studying for 3 years in the books of Bhaktivedanta Swami, I was not looking for spirituality. I wasn't looking for God. Nothing, far from it. I had to admit to myself, though, I was about 22 years old, and I had just left the States. I had gotten my Bachelor's of Science degree in psychology, backpacked around Europe, and since 1980, I'd been studying some of the books of Bhaktivedanta Swami. In the summer of 1983, backpacking around Europe, I read Bhagavad Gita as it is, cover to cover. And I had to admit to myself, despite myself, that this makes more sense than anything else I've been exposed to, anything else I've studied. And so I liked to consider myself an honest person. And so I thought, well, if I want to consider myself an honest person, I can see that these books, these ancient literatures, they not just present a consistent, cogent, coherent, internally consistent, matching my experience of reality, a philosophical system that's really satisfies my intelligence. They also say, and if you want to experience the truths of these philosophical assertions. Here's a process. Here's a laboratory you can enter. So I thought I owed it to myself to try the process a lot more seriously than I'd done till then. And so I moved into a bhakti-yoga ashram outside of Tel Aviv, Israel in 1984. And I thought I'll give it a 6-month experiment. And it's like almost 40 years later. And I can say I'm still doing the experiment because I'm deeply satisfied with the results. If someone else says, well, I did the experiment and I didn't experience anything, doesn't work for me, it's not for me to try to argue against their experience. I'd want to hear from them. I'm glad to hear. Tell me more what your experience was, what you did, what your doubts are, what your skepticism is based on. I'd want to hear from them more about their experience and enter into conversation.
Well, one thing I could like I've got this in my mind because I was having this discussion with a skeptic that I had an interview with called Nathan of Digital Gnosis, who I mentioned earlier, and he was making that point about psychologizing and questioning someone's sincerity. But I think that it actually is the same thing being done on both sides.
Yeah.
So if for example, we got to that point in the discussion because I quoted. I don't know where the quote's from, unfortunately, but there's a quote that there's enough darkness in the world for those who want to find it. Oh no, what is it? A little bit of science will make you an atheist, but a lot of science will make you a theist. And then he gave an example of James Fodor, who's very well versed in science, but is an atheist. And he's like, so how can that be true if that quote is also true? And then it's like, well, then you have to go to the sincerity. And it's like, well, you don't want to go there, do you? But it's like, okay, well, what about two people who know the science inside out, and one of them is a theist and one of them is an atheist? So
Sure.
how do you need a symmetry breaker? How do you explain that they came to different conclusions? Because obviously you want to say that one of them's right and the other one's wrong, or we have some ability to know these things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a quote from Carl Rogers. I might have it right here exactly, but so basically, okay. So Carl Rogers wrote, I happen to have it here. A personal subjective choice made by man sets in motion the operations of science, which in time proclaims that there can be no such thing as a personal subjective choice. So, I read that because I think it relates to what you just presented, Arjuna. Okay. So, because I guess there might be a mistaken assumption, in my opinion, that so you have one person, one science, objective science, and one person came to this conclusion. There's no higher intelligence. One person came to this conclusion. There is a divine whatever. But okay, so let's not assume that those two persons, that they're just completely objective and they can't. How could they come to different? No, there's all sorts of subjectivity going on, and so that's why it's not surprising that they might even study the same data, but there's all sorts of subjectivity. There's all sorts of subjectivity. I'm not saying good, bad, evil, but just different inspirations, drive, different points of view to defend, or different levels of openness to discovery or skepticism, different childhood wounds from this life, maybe from previous life. So there's so much subjectivity going on, and even our perception of their conclusions is influenced by our subjectivity. There's some subjectivity going. That's why for me it's not surprising that two persons learned in modern science would come to a vastly different siddhanta or conclusion. Let's not pretend in all of these efforts there's not a lot of personal subjectivity. moving, influencing process, maybe sometimes consciously, sometimes less than consciously, influencing how we process the data and what we make it mean.
All right, that's a nice point. I don't think we're going to have much time for the problem of evil if we don't get to it shortly. So there's a question from earlier. Oh no, was that the question? Yeah, was there much follow-up on your study? When was it done? Was it published other than as your dissertation and your book?
Yeah. I mean, not a huge amount, but I would say a significant amount. We've got lists of articles. We kind of condensed. We summarized the dissertation into various 20 to 25 page articles, published in various journals, psychological reports, published a few articles about the Vedic Personality Inventory, research on social work practice, published a major article about the Maha-Mantra dissertation. And there's been in 2006 a group of researchers headed by Harvey Stemple followed up on the Vedic Personality Inventory, and we can easily provide a bibliography of these, and they published in top psychological research journals. Their studies validated the findings of the Vedic Personality Inventory. As I mentioned, in recent years, the past 6-7 years, there's been on the basis of my psychological studies on the Maha-Mantra, there's been studies on the effects of Maha-Mantra on heart health, on neurology. Recently, Dr. Mauricio Garrido and myself co-published an article about the Three Gunas, again based on the Vedic Personality Inventory research. The Three Gunas as a foundation for a new model of decision making, of how the intelligence works in decision making. And there's been a few others, so not like hundreds and hundreds of follow-ups, but maybe 15 or 20 different projects and articles. And I'll mention that because of the strong publication-based, research-based, just as one of many examples, in 2017, the Association of Coach Training Organizations, it's not just coaches, but these are like the founders. These are the founders of the major coach training schools worldwide. They had their annual international conference that year in Toronto, and it's got the Association of Coach Training Organizations, ACTO. They invited me as a representative of the Satvatove Institute School of Transformative Coaching to give a keynote workshop, and it was because it was entitled Mantra Meditation and Transformative Coaching, because they viewed Satvatove as on the cutting edge of spiritual approaches to transformational coaching. And because of the strong literature-based publications on the Maha-Mantra studies, they invited me to give a keynote presentation. And all in all, in the conference, there was about 150 directors of coach training organizations, top coach trainers worldwide. About 30 or 40 attended my presentation. And we described the epistemology, the philosophy, the psychology, the history of mantra chanting, specifically Maha-Mantra chanting. There was lots of lively questions, debate. And towards the end of the workshop, I distributed japa beads to everyone there. And we showed them how to chant Maha-Mantra and japa. And we all chanted a full Hare Krishna Maha-Mantra round in unison. So they all got a direct experience. Some of them came to me regularly for the next few days of the conference and said, some said it was the most life-changing experience they ever had, and they could not deny that.
Right, that's interesting. Are there any other points you want to make on that? Because then we can segue into the problem of evil.
I'll stop there. I'll just say I have other examples of that because of the fairly extensive research and publication base in academia, we've been invited to many places to present philosophically and practically on the Maha-Mantra.
Right. So yeah, just to make some finer points on that. So, if chanting Hare Krishna offers this benefit and not a similar arrangement of syllables, which is not said to be God's holy name, then why would that be the case if it's not that, the theory is true that it's God's holy name? If it's just, the psychological benefits from chanting, then you would expect that any mantra would give similar results.
Yes.
But that's not what we find. And also, I really like your point about the pharmaceuticals, that if you found that much success, that much psychological benefits from a pharmaceutical, there'd be huge funding go into it. It would, everyone would be publishing about it and all sorts of stuff. But because it's about a mantra which isn't profitable and which brings in a metaphysics which nobody really wants to know about in this atheistic world, nobody's interested. Well, some people are interested, not many. As Prabhupada said, when you're selling diamonds, you can't expect to have many customers.
Yeah, thank you for that addition. Thank you. I like it.
And then, so the problem of evil, the reason why I wanted to discuss the problem of evil with you is because of your counseling background. So the problem of evil is generally dealt with logically, and lots of people say Alvin Plantinga, with his free will defense of theism in response to the problem of evil, has destroyed the logical problem of evil. Maybe I should briefly comment on that. But basically, the problem of evil is basically if God's all loving, all powerful, and all good, then why do bad things happen to good people? Why is there so many horrible things in the world? Surely if God were all loving, he'd do something to improve our experience in this world. He'd be compassionate and prevent so much suffering. But we don't see him doing that. Therefore, he's either not all loving, not all powerful, or doesn't care about us. So the free will defense is basically like, well, God gave us free will, and you can't give people free will and stop them from misusing it. And because we have free will and some people misuse it, we have suffering in the world. But then there's the emotional problem of evil. And the emotional problem of evil is not so easy to address. So another way the logical problem of evil is addressed is to say, all you need to demonstrate to solve the logical problem of evil is that it's logically possible that God needs to allow some evil in the world in order to prevent a greater evil. In other words, some amount of suffering is necessary to prevent greater suffering. So you go to the dentist and they do the minimum amount of invasive surgery possible, and they do it in the least painful way possible in order to bring about a greater good. If the dentist causes more pain than they need to, then they're violating their Hippocratic oath or whatever. They're not a good dentist. So similarly with theism, it's possible that the suffering which we go through, the suffering that some people are born into, or seemingly good people suffering, that suffering is actually a necessary thing in order for them to learn some priceless life lesson, to gain some wisdom. So you can watch old Oprah episodes. I watched one when I was a kid, and someone's on there who's grew up in some abusive environment, and they said that they got deep wisdom out of their suffering. And Oprah asked this person, would you rather have never suffered and not have that wisdom? Or would you rather have that wisdom but have gone through the suffering you went through? And the person replied, the suffering is worth the wisdom that I gained. It's not worth losing this wisdom at any cost. So of course you can say that, and you can give an example like I just did, but that's not so convincing. So I've often thought the best way to address the problem of evil is to get people who work in palliative care or counseling on to share some stories. Well, you don't have to give specific stories. You can just give your realizations about it.
Okay. Well, you mentioned Oprah, so I'll just share related to the previous topic that actually Oprah magazine mentioned the Hare Krishna Maha-Mantra research in an article in I think it was the August 2016 issue, and it was right next to an article entitled "Your Thighs Are Going to Thank You." Just thought to mention that. So yeah, so sure. I mean, I could share thousands of stories. I could share thousands of stories in that regard, where where someone becomes truly grateful for the life lessons, for the wisdom they got, for the deep fulfillment they got as a result of going through tremendous suffering. I could share, so many stories. I mean, my own life, but not that my life is any particular special, but in counseling and facilitating thousands of people in seminars and conducting therapy, children who've suffered terrible abuse. And just like you shared the story with Oprah and her interviewee, and so many examples like that. And so, it gets to, again, like before I said, like, well, how we experience this, can we be an illusion? Well, who is this person who's having the experience? Am I my belly? Am I my eyes? Am I the mind? Am I the operator of the computer? So similarly, like, what is a bad thing and what is a good person, And so oftentimes I'll see discussions, why do bad things happen to good people? And oftentimes from my perception, the discussions are kind of based on superfluous, axiomatic misunderstandings, or just even lack of conversation around what's a bad thing, what's a good person. Sure, maybe the child in the dentist chair definitely sees the dentist as evil. The dentist is definitely evil, but the parents and the dentist, they have some more of a meta view, and they say, oh, the dentist is doing good here. So yeah, what's a bad thing? What's a good person? And it gets into, well, what's the actual purpose of life? Is the purpose of life to enjoy a picnic on a sunny day? And not every day is sunny. So God is evil, where there is no God. I mean, what's the purpose of life? What's a bad, and that gets into understanding, again, distinction between matter, gross matter, subtle matter, spirit. What is the law of karma? What's action, reaction? And then again, so that's why, to be honest, these questions about evil and how could God allow this, they don't bother me. And I'm not saying they shouldn't bother others. And I like to think it's, well, because you're just the shallow person, David Wolf, who doesn't think deeply about things. I like to think that's not the case. But in studying this philosophy of bhakti-yoga, ancient Vedas as given by Bhaktivedanta Swami, that understanding the nature of self, the nature of illusion, the nature of the purpose of self-realization, and the self turning towards the supreme in a spirit of devotion, the purpose of, let's call it, the prison house of the material energy and its various structures, then I don't know, for me, the pieces fit together, the dots connect. And I'm not saying that I have so much realization how they connect. I have realization that satisfying for that. No, I know, like, yeah, I'm full. I'm full. And I'm not saying I have realization that could powerfully convince others about, no, the dots all connect, and the dentist is not an evil person, even though the 3-year-old is thinking, or the 6-year-old is thinking. So, and so to get into, well, how do the dots connect? I love those conversations. For me, that would get into, it would get into, again, the nature of the car and the driver of the car, the nature of what is the principle of karma, the nature of, did we exist before the birth of this body? If so, is it random chance that we got this body? And or just as my consciousness creates my life tomorrow and next year and next decade, so my point of view, consistent with ancient Vedic teachings, is I'm the source even of the circumstances of my birth, who my parents were, the socioeconomic condition I was born into. So an example could be like, let's say if I walk into a courtroom, and as I walk in, I see there's a nice young man, nicely dressed, clean cut. He looks like a very virtuous, righteous person. And just as I walk in, the judge points to him and says, I sentence you to be hung by the neck until you die. And then I'm outraged. I'm appalled. How can you do that? He's such a nice man. How could you do that? Everyone else in the courtroom looks at me and goes, well, you weren't here for the past 2 weeks and hear about he brutally murdered and tortured and raped. You didn't hear this. Yeah. So, let's say the 60 years in the body called David Wolf, this isn't even a lightning flash. This is just coming in the middle of the movie. So I have, so this all satisfies my intelligence, and I'm glad to explain why. And on these principles, then and at least I'm not saying like I don't have emotion around individual circumstances. I do. I have empathy around my pain, others' pain. At the same time, in the meta view, I'm not seeing bad things happening to good people. Sorry.
So one thing people might say back to that is this is victim blaming. You're just saying people who are born into horrible conditions in this life are to blame for their own suffering because they themselves have done horrible things in a past birth.
I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying it's not about blaming. I'm saying that, at least speaking for myself, that a stance, that I'm not a victim. I'm not pointing the finger at anyone. I'm looking at myself. I'm not a victim. I'm 100% responsible for my experience of life and the circumstances of my life. Now, someone. So that's, I'll call it, it's a point of view that's true for me, that works for me. I'm responsible for my experience of life. I'm the source of my experience of life. I'm responsible of the results in my life. And that's true now. It's always been true, including before I took birth as David Wolf. And in my life, I have, relative to others, I've maybe got some advantages, and I'm less fortunate than others from a material calculation. More fortunate some, less fortunate than others. And so for me, it's not at all victim consciousness, victim blaming. For me, it's empowering that I am the responsible author of my life. And that for me, that's a paradigm that moves me to empowerment. Like, okay, so what experience, what results am I inspired to be the source of in co-creation with higher powers? And my response to that, which I don't need to, I'm not meaning to impose on it, but my response to that relates to, for me, purposeful living relates to being the source each day of my life of enhanced self-realization and connection with, I'll call it, higher guidance. So for me, that perspective, for me personally, it's quite the empowering perspective, not disempowering, blaming perspective.
So it sounds like you're saying, from my own personal perspective, so like there's that verse in Bhagavatam, Tatenu Kampam Shushamikshamanar, that one who thinks that the bad things that happen to us in this life are reactions from things we've done previously, that this sets us up to be on a trajectory to become saintly. There's more in the verse than that, but that's the relevant point. I mean, obviously that's empowering and that's nice, but then when you see somebody else suffering and somebody addresses the problem of evil by appealing to the suffering of these other people, and if we want to say, oh, well, they're just getting their karma from a past birth, and it's the only way God can teach them the lessons they need to learn, or help their soul grow and mature in the ways it needs to, then they could say, oh, that's victim blaming.
Yeah, so that's why I don't do that, or at least I hope I don't do that. So if it's about someone else's suffering and pain, then it's not for me to say that's your karma. Then it's my role to be empathic and compassionate and to be paradukkha dukhi, to experience to that they feel received in their experience of pain and hurt and woundedness and rage. So it's one thing, like what I'm applying to myself, and with others, I'm empathic with their pain, and I can share dozens, if not hundreds, of true stories where let's say, for example, children who were terribly, severely maltreated in so many ways, sexually, physically, neglect, emotionally, psychologically, and like I'll be talking to them often, maybe when they're young adults, and I'm not telling them it's your karma, just accept it. No, I'm with them in their rage, their pain, their powerlessness, their shame. I'm empathically with them. And in so many instances, not that it comes from me, in so many instances, they come to a perspective, and it's liberating for them of 100% responsibility for what happened to them, and for what, we can't change the past, we can change what's happening now. And I've seen hundreds of circumstances where young adults who were severely abused as children, they embrace, not coming from David Wolf or Dhira Govinda Das. My role is to be empathic. They embrace a stance of 100% responsibility, and they experience liberation from resentments. It is sometimes said, resentments like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. So they start valuing themselves enough in an empowered way to drop the resentment. And just to be clear, 100% responsibility doesn't mean that what the other person did is right. That, in fact, I've seen these youth or middle-aged persons, they fully accept, I'm 100% responsible for what happened to me in my experience and my experience now. And they stand strong, and what the other person did is bad and evil. I didn't do anything wrong. I am the source of my experience, and what the other person did is bad and wrong. And now that I've dropped my resentment and bitterness, now I'm more empowered to put him in prison if I want to tell him what he did to me and how it stinks and how what he did is wrong and bad. Because sometimes there's a misconception. If I accept responsibility, it means making what the other person did right. No. A responsibility conversation, it's a conversation of discovery, and it's almost always separate from a conversation of what is good, bad, what is moral, who's at fault. So, yeah. I could go on that and give lots of analogies and examples. So it's not for me to impose on someone else, it's your karma. Me seeing that, yes, karma is such an empowering point of view. In the preface to another book of mine, actually the foreword of Relationships That Work, The Power of Conscious Living, the foreword's written by Peter Burwash. And Peter Burwash, maybe you or your listeners are aware, he was a touring tennis pro on the tour in the 70s, and he developed the most successful tennis management, tennis teaching company on the planet, and still thriving. Peter Burwash International. So Peter Burwash, he met Prabhupada in Mayapur, India, I think 76, maybe 77. And at that time, Burwash, just before that, he had been cheated by a so-called friend and business partner. He'd been cheated out of a lot of money. And in his foreword that he wrote for the book, he describes himself as kind of growing up as a selfish individual. That's how he described self-absorbed. And then he says, and then at that point in my life, I met a spiritual teacher who told me the two most important things I've ever heard. and the spiritual teacher is A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. And he said, the first thing is spiritual life begins when you understand the law of karma, and 2, don't be angry at the instrument of your karma. So karma, the misconception is, this is a philosophy that supports victimization. Saint Augustine said, never judge a philosophy by its abuse. The actual principle of karma is completely consistent with a stance of empowered 100% responsibility. We create our karma and we can destroy our karma. As you know, Arjuna, Bhagavad Gita deals with five main topics. 4 of them are eternal. 1 of them, karma, is temporary. By cultivating sattva gun, what to speak of Shuddha sattva, we change our karma. And so when Prabhupada says spiritual life begins when you understand the law of karma, he's saying, from my understanding, that as long as we're resisting the principle that I stand 100% responsible. So this is for me personally. Again, if I'm talking to someone else, my role is to be empathic and compassionate and let them, guided by their inner intuition, go to whatever realizations will serve them. So me standing 100% responsible, then I'm freeing myself to engage in spiritual life rather than resisting this basic principle.
Right. Like sometimes you hear stories and these objections from Christians. Like I interact with some Christians in India who have lots of objections to Hinduism and karma and reincarnation and so on. That there'll be cases of in India where somebody's a beggar, like a child is begging and hungry, and people won't feed them because they say, "Oh, well, that's this person's karma. It's our karma to have food, and this person's karma to not have food. Why should we interfere?" But obviously, this is a complete misunderstanding of what karma is, because part of karma it can't be divorced from an understanding of dharma, and dharma is what are my duties. So I have a duty to act in a certain way, and part of my dharma is to reduce the suffering of other people when it's possible for me to do so. When it I mean, obviously there's debates and ethics whether I should never buy a brand new sweater because I should give all of my money to charity and just live above the poverty line. That's a different thing, but definitely within reason we should be helping other people where possible and be compassionate, and we should not consider, oh, this person's karma to suffer. God is in charge of their karma, not me. So if I am able to help this person, I cannot violate God's will. So if I can do something to help this person, then I am the agent of of their karma. I'm God's agent delivering them some compassion. And this is the way I want to be. I can be the delivery of people's bad karma, or I can be the delivery of people's good karma. And if I'm on the good side, then I'll be happy. And if I'm on the bad side, I'm creating bad karma for myself, and I'll suffer in the next life.
Thank you, Arjun. I appreciate how you integrate dharma into the karma discussion. Yeah, related. I've certainly talked in conversations in therapy and coaching with young people, middle-aged adults who were like terribly abused as children, and sometimes the whole concept of karma would be used against. Oh, it was your karma. Even the abuser would say that. And then I've heard some of them come to realization, I accept I created karma that attracted that to happen to me, and now my dharma is to put you in prison. There's no contradiction there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, dharma is an important principle, and because that understanding that I gave it, of you do find that in India of people who won't give charity because they think, well, I'm messing with God's compassion. I mean, there are times when if you go beyond a certain level, maybe you are messing with someone's karma. Like, of course, there's another difficult question, which is perhaps worth addressing, that there's this idea that of euthanasia is not bona fide because we have a certain amount of karma to suffer in this life. And even for animals, euthanasia is not considered bona fide from a Vedic context. And I'm probably opening myself up to objections because skeptics might watch this and they'll think it's a bad thing. But So there is a point where it's like, no, at this point, you're interfering with someone's karma. But it is bona fide. Like apparently, a cow that's sick will naturally go and sit in a cold river, and so that it speeds up its death. So it is bona fide to, if you're really sick, there's examples of devotees who are sick with cancer and it's terminal. They just stop eating. You stop eating and you're sick. You've got about a week to go, as opposed to this whole modern thing where they keep somebody alive using all sorts of medical interventions, and all that really does is make them spend more time dying, and it's questionable whether that's beneficial. But of course, euthanasia for humans is generally considered to be anathema, but to be beyond the pale. But some countries have brought it in, and there's great contentions to it. But for animals, if an animal's sick, you just kill it. If you don't kill a sick animal, like devotees in New Zealand care for cows, and and I think in England, and maybe in England it was, they had problems where, the cows get old and the devotees haven't killed the cow yet, and people walk past. I think it happens at the temple actually. If a cow gets too old, you can't like leave them on the temple where all the public drives past and see it, because people from Western society see an old cow and they've never seen that before, and they think, these people, look how sick this cow is. Look how unhealthy this cow is. They're doing cow abuse here. But all it really is it's just old age, and nobody's ever seen an old cow. So perhaps you can comment on that.
Yeah. Well, I think to the extent that a society becomes materialistic, then there's increased endeavor to hide the the miseries and suffering intrinsic in the processes of old age, disease, and death. I remember, actually, my first book from the early 90s is entitled Krishna, Israel, and the Druze An Interreligious Odyssey. And there's one story in the book. I was living in an Arab village called Ramah in the north of Israel. The name of the village is Ramah. And I was dressed in dhoti, kurta, tilak. I was carrying a book cart with books in Arabic and Hebrew, and I was just towards the top of the village, and this was a Christian Arab gentleman. He opened the door and he warmly invited me in, very hospitable. And I noticed there that in the corner of the big room there was a person dying. And the grandchildren were there, and there was this elderly man dying, and it was just sort of accepted. And I was just thinking, like in America, most places, like where I came from, it's like, well, it would be time to put him or her in a nursing home, in a retirement home, because the idea is to hide these things, because the goal of life is svaroham aham bhogi siddhoham balavansuki, to control and to enjoy, and to be reminded of, to use an analogy, like, let's say if we get a gift of the car of our dreams, whatever the car of our dreams is, and here's the car, here's the keys, it's all paid off, the insurance is paid, you get the keys, you just enjoy in the car. One thing, in this car, there's a bomb that will go off, and it might go off later today or tomorrow, maybe in a year, maybe in 2 weeks, maybe in 10 years, but whatever, you just don't mind. The bomb's going to go off whenever. You just enjoy. Well, okay, so for the driver to actually enjoy, the driver would need to do some intensive numbing to forget that at any moment the bomb can go off. So much of materialistic society is about numbing, and that can stifle the soul's natural process to realize the janma mrityu jara vyadi dukkha dosha nudarshanam, to realize the inherent miseries, the inherent unnaturalness of being stuck in a body that's subject to death, disease, old age, birth. Birth is also a misery. And so whereas like in societies where, now old age is happening, disease is happening, death is happening for the animals, for the humans, then, not that we want to overly indulge in it, but then it's important that even as children, people see how this, we don't want death, we don't want old age. What's life about? It supports more of a spirit of atato brahma jigyasa, who am I? What's the purpose of life? What is it that dies? Is there anything that doesn't die? Whereas if we hide all that and we're dedicated to numbing and avoiding and escaping that reality, then we're perpetuating this cycle of misery for ourselves and others. So those are some important philosophical points, I believe. And then practically, I like the way you expressed, Arjuna, that there's a balance between fulfilling dharma and over endeavoring, like with extraordinary measures with this machine, and then let's spend millions of dollars and we can maybe extend the life or the death for another 2 days or 2 months. So like at what point does it become we don't want to neglect our dharma. We don't want to out of fear go overboard to hide the natural processes of death, disease, and old age and birth, because there's a purpose there that relates to the highest purpose of human existence. So we don't want to go out of our way to hide it, and neither in the name of dharma do we want to do prayashas, over endeavor to do unnecessary extraordinary measures, to try to extend the body's life like that. Those are a few thoughts.
Right. Yeah. Coming back to the problem of evil and the victim blaming. So, I mean, I think it's the case that from a theological perspective. So, if we're just sitting around and philosophizing, we can say that if somebody, gets a bad reaction in this life, it's because of something they did earlier in this life or in a previous life. If your example of how you dealt with that objection was to say how you would talk to a victim who you were speaking to, or how you might speak to the family, none of that would come up. So those are two different considerations. One is, how do we, when we're in our armchairs, talk about the theology, and the problem of evil is about God. It's about how can God be good when all these bad things in the world. We're talking about God here. And then when we have a victim, somebody who suffered, how do we talk about the victim? And one way Chaitanya Charan has talked about this is when there's a person who's suffering, this is not the right time to talk about what they did to deserve it. That's not
Right.
the right consideration. That's the wrong question to ask. Anyone who's looking at things that way has it all back to front. And you've given some examples of, the correct attitude to have when you have a victim in front of you, or the families of a victim, or are speaking about a victim. You don't get all philosophical. And some atheists might object, like, oh, here's a problem for your theology. Not something that is true to say that it's not. If it's not beneficial to say in all circumstances, how can it be true? And of course, if you really articulate what it is they're saying with that objection, like I just did, it sounds super silly because, I mean, similarly, the atheist doesn't, when they have a victim in front of them, say, you know what? None of this is actually matters because, before long, the heat death of the universe is going to happen and we'll all be completely gone. So don't sweat it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, just thank you for that and for referencing Chaitanya Charan also. Yeah. So obviously in all sorts of conversations, especially conversations of any depth, naturally it's not about being deceptive or duplicitous, but naturally we share about, we use our discretion about what to share with who at what time. And like in any conversation, like maybe even we have some important interpersonal conversation to have, but we sense, okay, what's my mood? What's my consciousness? What's the other person? I think for now, let's just have a quiet dinner together. Maybe tomorrow afternoon will be a better time for this more emotionally charged conversation. So similarly, when someone's in pain, like that, someone's in pain and hurt and woundedness and suffering and shame, anger, rage, then not in an absolute sense, but usually often, like it's going to be most effective to support them in their process, to empathize with compassion, and not to make them right or wrong. Just like that's probably not the time to philosophize. There is a time to philosophize, and that might be that's a different container, a different set of circumstances.
Right. And then the other objection they could use is surely God could have a better way of teaching us lessons than rape and torture and natural disasters. Like, why does it have to be so horrible? And I've had Christians use this objection. They get quite graphic. They're like, so somebody who rapes in a previous life and they get raped in this life, God won't use rape to teach us lessons. God is, you can't have God be muddied in such a way as to use something like that to teach us a lesson. So the Christian on theology, I don't think they have an answer to the problem of evil personally, because they just say it's arbitrary. We're just suffering. This is just the nature of the world. Free will, and it's kind of things are a little bit out of God's control. The devil's sort of there's a battle going on between God and the devil, and the devil's kind of gets the upper hand at times, and people misuse their free will and bad things happen to good people, and somehow they think that addresses the problem of evil. But what would you say to that?
Well, if I understand the sort of objection you're presenting, what I say to myself is like, I feel really grateful to have heard and been exposed to this philosophy from the ancient Vedas through Bhaktivedanta Swami, and the whole principle of transmigration of the self, transmigration of the soul. The soul is the actual self. I've used that term a few times. The irreducible quanta of consciousness, that's the actual self. And so that for me, that's like a foundation and on that foundation, the house stands strongly. We understand past lives. Yeah, we're just coming in the middle of the movie, we're in the middle of the courtroom hearing. So understanding transmigration, karma as responsibility. For me, I don't know, that satisfies my intelligence, and I do my best when in conversation with someone who's maybe rejecting that to explain why it makes sense to me, and ready to hear from them. Until now, I haven't heard any rational reason from my point of view that it doesn't make sense. I would say I haven't heard anything better, but that's not quite it, because it's not like, well, I accept karma and transmigration because I haven't heard anything better. Now like, I'm really open-minded to hear something better, but it's really satisfying. It's not just like, well, it's all I have, but like it's really complete, and it responds to all those questions you just asked as the devil's advocate.
Well, to me, that sounds like a kind of skeptical theism. So for those that don't know, skeptical theism with regard to the problem of evil is like, some young child gets cancer. We just don't know how God's working and what God's achieving through that cancer. We can't possibly understand God to the degree that we could possibly say that God can't have a good reason for giving this young child cancer, just to give one example. So with regard to the example of all the objections I raised that I've got from Christians and atheists of all these horrible things in the world, and sometimes they get quite graphic, and like a really good argument against theism based on the problem of evil gets really graphic, that you go into detail a story, and it's emotionally irking, and you think, my God, how could it be true that there's an all-loving, all-powerful God that allows such horrible things to happen? So many people give up their faith because they see terrible things happen. So, I mean, is it just skeptical theism, or can we go deeper and say, no, actually, I have seen that these horrible things actually do bring about great wisdom and great transformation, and in the particular cases where I've seen that, less suffering couldn't have been incurred to bring about the same result.
Well, for myself, I would say yes. I say I give a strong yes. I've seen and witnessed such terrible suffering result in profound, joyful realizations. So I've seen sufficient enough of that for me to have, I'm not going to say complete, but for me to have deep, powerful realization of the principle I'm talking about. So for me, it's not just some dry, hollow, skeptical theism argument that sort of kind of makes sense. I've seen enough in my 60 years in this body to give substance to that viewpoint.
I think like Jordan Peterson tells a lot of archetypal stories, and he talks about like the dragon that you're running from is far scarier than the dragon that you're facing. So, you know,
Okay.
when you're running from a problem, it can be very scary and seem really terrible. This is kind of what goes on with post-traumatic stress disorder. And a lot of the therapy, you'll know more about it than me. A lot of the therapy for PTSD is to get people to sit with the things that trigger their emotions and face it.
Yeah, sure.
And by facing the dragon, by facing the thing we're terrified of, we actually find that, you know, it's not the devil out to get us, that there's actually some treasure that we can find by facing these horrible things in the world and sitting through the suffering. I mean, not that we should spend our time watching documentaries about everyone's suffering, but, you know, at the suffering that naturally does come up in our lives, and, you know, when we have friends that are suffering, when we actually sit with that and, you know, don't shy away from it, but actually face it, then we get deep realization and we grow and learn as a person. So this is one way we can all learn that suffering is actually here to teach, rather than, you know, some horrible thing that's in the world because the world is just cruel and unjust.
Yeah, and that relates to our discussion earlier, Arjuna. Yeah, that like, okay, there is intrinsic suffering in the processes, pain, agony, torment, torture in old age, disease, death, and there's so many lessons to be realized, not just learned, but realized by experiencing them and witnessing them. And so when we have a culture or society that tries to cover that, then it's really like depriving humans of experiences that are meant to be essentially human, and that's experiencing the pain and suffering and all of old age, disease, death, birth, and all of the realizations that are intrinsic to living a purposeful life that go with them. I'll just mention, since you mentioned like PTSD, so I'll mention like, yeah, I conducted my mantra studies in the 90s, started publishing also in the late 90s, and like one day, it was around maybe 2001, 2002, I got a phone call from Dr. Jill Borman. And Dr. Jill Borman, she had seen in some of the journals my studies on the mantra. I co-authored some of them with Dr. Neil Abel, who was my major professor for my Ph.D. And so Dr. Borman, she was so excited to see the studies because she had been conducting mantra research already for many years with veterans, with war veterans. It was at the San Diego Veterans Hospital. She had been conducting research for many years with veterans who were suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. And she was engaging them in mantra chanting with very inspiring results. She's published many articles, and she called mantra chanting a jacuzzi for the mind. Anyhow, so I've been in touch with Jill Borman for about 20 years, and as a result of our connection, with what she was doing with those veterans who suffered from PTSD, she had a list of mantras for them to choose from in different languages from different traditions. And as a result of our connection, she added to the list the Hare Krishna Maha-Mantra for veterans suffering from PTSD to choose from. So yeah, this experience of pain, it's intrinsic to the material context of the human context. And there's meant to be, just like ideally, maybe not in reality, but metaphorically, ideally, the prison system is not ideally meant for just like useless pain and torture. It's really meant to, I'm suffering here in prison. let this inspire me to become a law-abiding, contributing citizen. Ideally, the prison system is meant for rehabilitation.
Right. We'll wrap it up shortly. We're coming up on 2 hours. Did you want to share any anecdotes with regard to the problem of evil, or any other examples or stories?
Well, I've shared a few kind of generally, because I've conducted a lot of therapy and process with young adults who were severely abused as children. I feel complete for now.
All right, cool. Yeah. Gabriel Mate gave one example. I couldn't find the lecture. I should try and find the clip. He worked in palliative care for 10 years. You're probably familiar with Gabriel Mate.
Yeah.
That he had one patient who was in there. They were selling he had a business partner, and they were selling some product which was supposed to be a cancer treatment. And this man got cancer and was now dying of the cancer. And it was something that you eat. And even though it clearly hadn't worked, he was in palliative care and was on his deathbed, he was still taking this medicine that they were selling. And he asked him, "Why are you doing that?" He said, "Oh, if my business partner finds out that I stopped taking it, he'll be really upset." It's like, why do you care what your business partner thinks? You're dying. What does that matter? And this person on his deathbed had a transformation in his consciousness of like how he relates to himself and the world and his attitude on life. And so on his deathbed, dying of cancer, he said to Gabriel Mate that this cancer is the best thing that's happened to me. It killed him, and he said this. So, I mean, obviously, it's better hearing these stories from the person who's actually heard it firsthand. I just heard it in a podcast, and I'm retelling it. So, I'm sure you've got maybe not quite as extreme as that, because palliative care is a whole nother level. But that's the basic principle where I'm getting into with the problem of evil, and the idea that the suffering is actually here to teach us something. I mean, I've heard it said, and I haven't found an exception to it, that everybody who survives cancer has a radical transformation in their consciousness and their attitude on life. So it's like the cancer came to teach them a lesson. The lesson was learned, so the cancer goes away.
I've witnessed that in many persons. Yeah, thanks for sharing that story from Gabriel Mate. I am familiar with him, and I know him personally to some extent.
All right. I tried to get him on for an interview. I reached out, and I got a reply from his assistant saying he's too busy. My platform's probably not big enough. So we can wrap it up there. Thanks for coming on. Were there any final points you wanted to discuss?
I feel complete, and I thank you for this opportunity. I'm very enlivened by the discussions.
Yeah, cool. I appreciate all your nice research. It's nice talking to devotees who have really thought about these things and put academic work into it. It's important service. All right. So thanks for tuning in. If you like this kind of stuff, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Let us know what you think down in the comments. Hit the like button. It helps us in the algorithm. And I'll see you next time. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Arjun.